Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome. Welcome back to another video over here on That's Comical. And of course, if you happen to be watching and it is a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. It is great to finally be back doing a live recording. And of course, I've got my co-host Andy with me. Andy, it is always great to record videos with you as well as the rest of the staff here on this channel.
Yep, very happy to be here. This is a good one.
Yeah, because this is our second episode. It's quite crazy to say that we've only done one of these. It's just because, you know, everything that's been going on in everybody's lives, we just had to put a lot of stuff on the back burner, but it looks like things are finally starting to free up a little bit of time for us. So you guys are all definitely should be very excited because there's a lot of great stuff in the works that we're going to try and get to you guys before we close out 2022. So of course, if you do like this video, do not forget to give a thumbs up and leave us a comment. We'd love to talk to you. And of course, if you like everything you've seen on this channel so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're up to date with all of our latest content. So Andy, it's a big day today because this is the second episode of Character Profiles. We had a great pilot launching discussing one of our personal favorite heroes and probably one of the most overlooked in the DC Comics universe, and that of course is Robin in its many forms. But it would have been foolish to not capitalize on the fact that 2022 is a big anniversary for a specific beloved superhero in the world of Marvel Comics. And that, of course, is the 60th anniversary of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So what can we possibly do to start off on this specific character? I mean, let me just go through the laundry list. I mean, when you hear the name Spider-Man, you know who it is. If you are a young boy or girl or anything in between, you probably have known about Spider-Man ever since the day you were born. Because outside of other heroes like Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman, I would probably say, and I might get slaughtered in the comments because of this, if you take a look at the most beloved superheroes in all of comic books, I would probably say that Batman will always be number one, but I think Spider-Man is probably number two and beating Superman, especially when we take a look at comics today.
Yeah, and you know what? I would say, I would word it even more strongly. So first off, in context, you know, we talked about Robin the last time we did one of these, and obviously Robin's a really important character that a lot of people know, but there's absolutely no comparison to Spider-Man. You know, for me, in my heart, my favorite comic book character, the most important one, is always going to be Batman. But, you know, if I'm being honest with myself and thinking about pop culture landscape, comics landscape, you know, more broadly, movies, TV, even music, I think there's definitely an argument to be made that we're discussing the most famous, the most popular comic character of all time today. Whether he's first in our hearts or close to the top, you know, is immaterial here. For some people, at the very least, probably for a lot of people, we're talking about number one, or at the very least, letter A. You know, it's like that 1A thing with Batman, right? So this is an exciting one. And I also something, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because I know we kind of have a structure to these discussions, but you know, my point of comparison with how we talked about Robin is there are fewer important Spider-Men, I think, like when we're doing the character profile, right? But I think we've got a lot to say about each of them, the ones that like rise to the level. And it's funny because I say this because there's an entire Spider-Verse, an entire multiverse of Spider-Man. Right. Yeah, exactly. But like when it comes down to it, there's some important figures in Spider-Man.
Absolutely.
Anyway,
yeah.
I don't want to go all over the place. It's just the thing is,
Yes.
There's a lot to say about Spider-Man, and I don't want it to get ignored just how important this character is. And I think anybody watching this video probably knows that, but just in case, let me say it, this is a big one.
And let me say what our co-host Cami normally says. Let me piggyback on what you're saying, Andy, because you are absolutely right. This character was created back in 1962, first appeared in Amazing Fantasy 15, created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. this couldn't have been a more perfect time for a character like Spider-Man to come out, because this was right in the midst of the silver age of superheroes and comics, which, in my personal opinion, I think is the best time for comic books, because it was the time when people were finally interested in getting back to superheroes. Also because of the fact, historically, the comics code had just recently been stamped on all the comic books. So a lot of these companies were trying to figure out, how can we still make money? But also because of the fact that we were right in the middle of the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, this was a great time for the sci-fi element really to come into comic books outside of fantasy. So you had characters in DC like Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern, or Barry Allen, the Flash. And then, of course, in Marvel, you started out in 1961 with the Fantastic Four, America's first family, which was when Stan Lee was basically saying, if Marvel Comics is going to hit it big, we need to start bringing out some of these superheroes. So Spider-Man comes out along with the Incredible Hulk and Thor, but alongside that, when you take a look at those guys, as the timeline moves on with popular culture, Spider-Man pretty much went ahead of the pack. You had cartoons. You had a short-lived live-action show in the 1970s. You had, like you said, a song that is pretty much in our lexicon. I mean, for crying out loud, there's a Simpsons spoof, Spider Pig. There's a line in Family Guy, thanks, Spider-Man, everybody gets one. Everybody knows that. But it's not just that. Movies. There's an Academy Award-winning animated Spider-Man film, Into the Spider-Verse. And not just in that side of pop culture, along with 1990s animated series that you and I definitely have watched, and many more Spider-Man series followed after that. But also take a look at some of the names that are associated with Spider-Man in the world of comics outside of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, because these men and women turned out to be some of the most well-known names in comics. You have J.M. DeMatteis. You have John Romita Jr. and John Romita Sr., his father. You have Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, J. Michael Straczynski, Dan Slott, Mark Bagley. You have the newcomers to the world of Spider-Man, and Nick Spencer, and now Zeb Wells. All of these names people know in comic worlds because they are associated with Spider-Man. So after saying all of this, here's the million-dollar question, Andy. Why do you think that is?
So I thought a lot about this, because that's one of the main things I wanted to touch on in this discussion, the why of it, right? And I think it's really important to remember that Spider-Man was truly revolutionary. You know, we talked about Robin, who is an adolescent character coming into his own, and you see the progression of at least Dick Grayson, you know, growing into Nightwing, the others who held the mantle, taking on their own titles, asserting their own, you know, sense of self. But Spider-Man, I don't want to say is the first, but he's the first important of them. No, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and say it. He's the first of any character that mattered that is a kid as a superhero. And that's the thing that people really latched onto, right? It's that if the thing that made Marvel so special in the Silver Age was finding the flaws in their character, the same reason like the Fantastic Four, you know, grew into fame, right? The same reason the X-Men grew into fame. It's the fact that they're fallible, that they weren't perfect characters, that they felt relatable. So Spider-Man had that, just like the other Marvel heroes did, but he's got that, he's a kid, he's a student. The target audience at the time could see themselves in Spider-Man in a way that they couldn't in any other hero. He was the guy who didn't get the girl. He was the guy who missed school reports because he was doing the right thing. He's so relatable. And I think the best Spider-Man stories since then, you know, into the current day, understand that that's what makes the Spider-Man character special. And we can talk about what that means for the plot in Spider-Man, what that means for the different characters that have taken on the mantle over time, and how, you know, they always need to just miss the mark, or every time there's success, you know, the following story arc has to have that fall back down to earth, because it's a character that's about the development of the character. And the thing that makes Spider-Man great is that he's always moving forward and trying to be that best version of himself. And that's always going to be relatable, not just to kids, but to any person, that he's always striving to be better than he is. And he's already great. So he's admirable. And just, anyway, I could go very off the rails here, but that's the core of what I'm saying. That's the essence of the character and what makes him so special. And so,
well, one of the few things that I'm really thrilled about, even though you are always so insightful, I'm always grateful that you always leave that one little thing out that it's in my mind so I can actually share it with you as well. One of the other reasons why I think Spider-Man is what really stands out amongst the other heroes is also the fact that even though he is a superhero, he doesn't have a guiding light with him to share his secrets with. Robin may have been one of the first superheroes that young minds could actually see themselves being, but Robin had Batman. And even when Batman's parents were killed, Bruce Wayne always had Alfred. This is the first time where a young hero is growing as a superhero, but unfortunately is acting on his own and can't go to people when he's having issues on the superhero end of his journey. Everything else you said, I agree with 100% and would have said if you didn't. But it's because of the fact that he is doing all of this on his own and he's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And even when he is trying to show some of the other big names in the world of Marvel superheroes that he can run with the big boys, sometimes they're not always accepting. I mean, I haven't read this, but thank goodness the facsimile edition is coming out later on this year. In the very first issue of The Amazing Spider-Man, he wants to join the Fantastic Four. And even though they have a young superhero in Johnny Storm, Peter Parker and Johnny Storm have a real fun love-hate buddy-buddy relationship. But even when Johnny is a young character as the Human Torch, when Spider-Man wants to join the Fantastic Four, they literally say to him, sorry, kid, you're not part of us. You got to do your thing on your own. And he's basically teamed up with the biggest names in Marvel. I mean, like, I don't know if this was like it in the comics, but I really would like to know what was Peter like when he first met Captain America for the first time, you know? Like, this is a legend. You saw how he met him in the MCU film, which was really fun. He's a young hero who is developing, and he has no one to fall back on. He can't even talk to his Aunt May about it.
And he gets to be a lens for the reader in a way that other heroes don't have. There's a sense of wonder to the character, because you're right. Let's talk about like when he first meets Captain America in the MCU. Like, there's that level of excitement and wonder that like a regular person would have. This is a legend. This is someone who, like we said, there's no guiding star for Spider-Man. You know, he's not Robin with a Batman that he's emulating, but he's emulating his own sense of right and justice. And so he is in awe of these people who seemingly, at the very least, again, Marvel loves its flawed characters, right? But he's in awe of these people who've got their, pardon my French, shit together in a way that he doesn't yet. But he's still admirable and is still a hero in his own right. And it's why we love him, right? And so you're exactly right to talk about trying to join the Fantastic Four, right? There's an important part of the character, which is him failing or not quite fitting in. I think everybody understands why it's important for there to be an admirable comic book character who doesn't fit in, right? Like that's a really important part of the relatability of the character. So
you're right.
I think you're exactly right. I think you picked up on a very, very important part of the character.
Yeah, and I also want to let everybody know, and I wouldn't call this a spoiler just because of the fact that these books have been out for a while, but if you want to see Spider-Man actually join the Fantastic Four, I highly recommend you all check out Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run and his series, The Future Frontier. Just check out that series. It is fantastic. Not to pun there, but that is a great one. But I think another reason why Spider-Man is the iconic character that he is also because, much like some of the other heroes out there, particularly Batman, and to a certain extent, I will say this for everybody to hear, The Flash has an excellent rogues gallery next to Batman. When it comes to DC characters and their rogues galleries, Spider-Man has an incredible rogues gallery. And I also think what makes that rogues gallery special is the fact that when Spider-Man goes up against these people, some of these are people that he actually knows as Peter Parker. And he's also one of those guys that goes after them, not just trying to stop them from doing the deeds that they're doing, but he also sees their flaws. At the same time, he sees their potential to do good. And along with trying to stop them to a certain extent, he almost always tries to save them. And we will go a little further into this, but one of those specific characters is his best friend turned his enemy at some point, Harry Osborn.
Yeah, and also something that I'll say that comes to mind while you're saying all of that, just that I think it's important to note. We started by mentioning Robin mostly because this is a series we're doing and Robin was our first episode. We've mentioned Batman now, not just because of that, but also as noted, I really think that Spider-Man is right there with him, or more popular, or more well-written, or better story. It just, the reason we're saying it is not because everything comes back to DC, everything comes back to Batman. Right now, it's just because you don't compare Spider-Man's rogues gallery to anyone else. There's no comic book character or series that can hold a candle to the rogues gallery in Spider-Man other than Batman. So we're forced to make this point of comparison.
They're a creative bunch.
It's the Sinister Six, bro. Like this.
Yes, that's another reason why I think Spider-Man is a character, especially a younger crowd can relate to. Batman doesn't have to go up against a team of 6 powerful villains all at once. Spider-Man goes up against 6 villains at once in the Sinister Six, and they're all brilliant, and they're all brutal, and they all want to kill him. And almost always, they're all together. Because another thing that this does happen to a lot of other comic characters out there, but it is always exaggerated in the Spider-Man comics. He always almost has his costume torn. He almost always has at least 2 ribs broken. So we know that this is a young kid that is trying to be a great hero, but my God, he is getting beaten, battered, and bruised all the time. And this is not because he is falling off of buildings, because his webs snap.
Can you think of any like notable Spider-Man story that doesn't involve at least one panel of him complaining about swinging with his broken ribs?
I can't recall.
This guy gets so beat up. It's that his struggles, he always needs to be outmatched. He always needs to be fighting an uphill battle. You know, Batman, and I'm going to stop doing it, I promise. I'll use another one. Superman. Superman obviously has his kryptonite. I mean, it's literally a phrase in pop culture, you know, what someone's kryptonite is, the flaw in the armor, the Achilles heel. But the difference there is Superman is the strongest being. You know, Batman is the smartest mind, or the most, you know, detective. He's not the smartest character, but he's the most
the world's greatest detective.
Right. Spider-Man is maybe, if you want to use superlatives here, the most pure-hearted character. The one who, while he misses the mark and where he doesn't always get it right, his intentions are always really pure. And when he fails, we understand why he fails. And when he does the wrong thing or teams up with the wrong people, we get that it came from a place of trying to live up to the expectations that are on his shoulders. And so it's in a superlatives discussion, he's the most pure-hearted. And that's admirable. And it's admirable in a way that can be emulated. And I
Yeah,
think that that's
absolutely.
really, really special.
Because you go all the way, because I actually have a copy of the facsimile edition of Amazing Fantasy 15, and I read it just the other day, just to give us a little bit of insight. Something that you just said, I really want to elaborate on, is even when he might be doing the wrong thing, he is still pure-hearted. And he literally does that at the very beginning when Uncle Ben dies, because at that point in time, he is just using his powers to make a quick buck and try to make an impression on his schoolmates. And because of the fact that he just doesn't stop a robber, that robber ends up killing his Uncle Ben, and he takes full responsibility for that, because with great power comes great responsibility. That was apparently a line that was right there in Amazing Fantasy 15 at the very end of the issue of the Spider-Man story. So it's something that hits home. It's something that I think is what makes Spider-Man the most iconic of Marvel's superheroes at this point. And I think it's the reason why he is so beloved, because of the fact that, like the young children, the young adults out there, they're trying to tackle life as best as they possibly can. And they see in Spider-Man that even people who have great powers still will hit these game-changing crossroads, and they wonder if the direction that they go in, is it going to be the right direction? And if I take that path, what's going to be the outcome, and what's going to be the aftermath? And then if it was bad, what would I have done differently if I took the other path?
Yeah, and I'll say that there is a special sauce to Spider-Man, drawing on what you just said, that, you know, it's important to note it's not just the surface and structural things we've been talking about. There is something that resonates about the Spider-Man character uniquely, and I think it goes back to the great writers that you were talking about, right? Because you can envision a character who is young and trying to do the best that they can, but doesn't resonate in the way that Spider-Man does. But here we are, you know, two guys who love comics, Spider-Man being a character that we have seen written well, written poorly, different stories, different themes being covered time and time again. But the ridiculous thing is, when I hear you for the first time in this episode say, with great power comes great responsibility, I've been exposed to this character for over 30 years of my life, and it still chokes me up to hear that, right? And there's a reason that they gloss over that quote in Into the Spider-Verse, that it was a thing in the MCU, that they said versions of it and didn't quite get to those exact words. Like, it was a big payoff moment that fans were waiting for, finding a way to have it not be trite, because it's not a trite idea. And
Right.
I go back to, it's in popular consciousness. It's a quote that people know. It's, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, it's like to the level of, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, in terms of everybody just kind of knows this by osmosis, right? But it lands and it matters, and it's something you think about in your day-to-day life. And you know, we're comic fans, right? So I don't mean to hyperbolize that, because I realize we're in this in a love, and people watching this are too, if you've sought out a video on YouTube about the Spider-Man character. But you get it, that there's something more to it than just the description. It was just done really, really well. And I think that matters and should be pointed out too.
Yeah.
Not just anyone could have done this, and not just anyone could have taken the surface elements of it and had it also become gold. It was done very well.
And not just that, I think another reason that makes Spider-Man the beloved character that he is even the bad stories that are in the Spider-Man comics are things that fans will come together on and just tear it to shreds. I mean, how many times have I been watching the comic book community, pardon my French, shit on Spider-Man One More Day? They know it's terrible, but they can't stop talking about it. That's what makes Spider-Man so special. Exactly. I love that. That and maximum clonage. I mean, the fact that the Spider-Man animated series of the 1990s made fun of that saga on its actual like second to last episode where Spider-Man meets Ben Reilly for the first time and says, "This sounds like a bad comic book story." It makes me laugh so much. But where we're going with this is Spider-Man also did something that DC really wasn't doing at the time. And because of the fact that it was Marvel that specifically started to take this initiative, and it was during the time frame in the late 70s when we were starting to see people getting a little bit tired of comics, saying, "Oh God, it's too campy, it's too kiddie," because we also have to recall that the very first comic books were really not necessarily for kids. They were very much for all audiences to a certain degree. Same thing with the original golden age of Disney films. You know, a lot of people keep forgetting that. But I'm going in this direction because when we started seeing what was going on in the late 70s, we had names like Chris Claremont coming into Marvel to revitalize the X-Men, and what a job that he did. We'll get to him at some point in time down the line because we have to. But the Spider-Man comics started focusing on specific game-changing stories that would drive the character forward. And The Amazing Spider-Man was one of the first comic books to go back to those dark roots with one specific story. And that, of course, is one that I am grateful that I also read right before we got to this discussion today. I read The Death of Gwen Stacy. It's just 2 issues, everybody, and it hits hard because at that point,
changes everything.
Absolutely, because before that, and what I mean before that, I mean from the authorization of the Comics Code all the way till the late 70s, early 80s, we really didn't get death or even blood to a certain degree in comic books. So we get this story about Peter finally getting the girl, but due to certain events, his life is coming asunder because he is dealing with one of the most brutal villains that he has ever faced in the Green Goblin. And it ends up that his girl, who he finally got, Gwen Stacy, in the heat of this battle between these true good versus evil faces, she dies in the process. And even though Peter knows it's not his fault, he still takes the blame because he's Spider-Man. Even though she didn't know he was Spider-Man, he still believes that to a certain degree it is his fault. And that's a real heavy thing to show a comic reading public, especially at the time, a much younger crowd.
Yeah, and there's a few things I'll pull on from what you just said. Starting at the beginning, I think it's important to talk about the way I think of family entertainment, right? Which is a true something for everyone. The stories that young and old, you enjoy it, and there's things for you. And I think you're right that it's important to remember that Spider-Man was written to include an audience that Golden Age comics and a lot of times weren't. I mean, granted, this is outside of comics, but like children as a market who are different from just being small adults was actually not new at the time of Silver Age, but in terms of human history, was actually pretty new. Like this is going to get too off the rails with like post-industrial revolution and pre-Cold War America, post-World War II. Anyway, all that stuff is.
Bring Jen in for that conversation.
but Spider-Man was written for an audience that, while it was always there, was newer and being targeted specifically by marketing, right? So, but it's family entertainment, so everyone can get something from that story. And I go back to what I was saying about with great power comes great responsibility. Known this character for 30 years, I still get choked up hearing and saying that. And the same thing is happening to me with you talking about the death of Gwen Stacy, because you're right. It was a moment where, in a post Comics Code world, we kind of got back to a level of darkness that comics might have started with and was like always an undercurrent, even if not like allowed to be explicitly on the page or things
Yeah.
happening on a panel that was assumed.
It also gave a lot more incentive for the Frank Millers and the Alan Moores of the world to finally get out there and start making their own darker stories. But yeah, and this is
exactly
when
right.
the comics code is very much in full force. So the fact that a story like The Death of Gwen Stacy could actually be brought to the comic book reading masses at the time is no less than a miracle.
Yeah, and all I mean to say is that it's stunning that the place where we see this transformative touchstone story in comics broadly, not just for the Spider-Man character, but happened in a Spider-Man book, given the genesis of the audience of who the character was for and who was reading the books at the time. It's just, it's a big deal. It's telling that that kind of thing happened within a Spider-Man story as opposed to within a Green Lantern story, a similarly beloved character, right? And this is not me saying anything negative about Green Lantern. I could name any character that is not Spider-Man, and it would have been less shocking for this kind of thing to have happened in their book. Really.
Squirrel Girl. I'm sorry, I had to do it.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think what's also kind of funny is one of the other things that also makes Spider-Man great is the fact that he literally is aging with his audience. I mean, I have no idea if this is right or wrong. Did he get married before Reed and Sue Richards? Or
now you're testing me. And here I was thinking about like their wedding as an important plot line to look into, but comparative timeline, I don't know.
I know he got married before Clark and Lois. I know that for a fact, which is kind of funny, you know? But the other thing that was also very iconic and also a real landmark in regards to Spider-Man is when a superhero is changed, it's not necessarily something that the audience is going to want. But fast forward just a few years later into the 1980s, we get that iconic Marvel crossover in Secret Wars. And this is literally 1 year before Crisis on Infinite Earths completely changes the DC universe and the comics lexicon pretty much for the better. And maybe later on in the 2000s for worse, I don't know. But Secret Wars issue number 8 gives Spider-Man the black costume. And the black costume saga shows us that dark side of Peter that we all knew was down there somewhere, very similar to when the Phoenix took over Jean Grey in the X-Men world, which literally happened around the same time. And what do we get out of the Black Costume Saga? We get an incredible look into Peter's head where he could, in fact, follow that legendary line, ironically from a Batman film, which is you either become the hero or see yourself long enough until you become the villain. And what does that create? It gives us Venom and a couple years later, Carnage, who are two of the most beloved Spider-Man villains, or in Venom's case now, an anti-hero.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about how, you know, this character who meant so much in the Silver Age continued to contribute to the creation of new stories and new characters that now resonate. I mean, not as much because Spider-Man is on a tier all on his own, but like that it's not retreading ground all the time, that fans welcomed the newness. And I will say it does go back to, because we talked about like when Spider-Man's wedding happened and growing with the audience. Because Spider-Man is a character that always needs to be striving, there's always an element of he falls back down to earth every few years. Sometimes that is done more artfully than other times. But, you know, I mean, fans have come to expect that. It's always shocking to people who are finding Spider-Man anew, and it lands because it works, because that's the nature of the character. I think about transformative scenes in Spider-Man stories. I think about being unmasked in Civil War.
Oh yeah.
I think about in recent time, I'm sure a lot of people who were new to the world of comics, thanks to the MCU, probably, you know, did not know what to do with themselves at the end of No Way Home. While it's a recreation of the character that all of us as longtime Spider-Man fans have come to expect, just that falling back to complete basics, he had everything and now he has nothing, is something we've seen a few times, but it's never any less heartbreaking when it happens. So it's interesting you pick on the Secret Wars reinvention and added depth of the character, but where my brain started, and by the way, I did reread Secret Wars not that long ago.
I never read
That is a
Secret Wars, I
great
have to
shout.
be honest.
Oh, really? Yeah, I mean, it's important just for the landscape of comics, the crossover event, and like what that means for comics forever after. But you know, it's just that Spider-Man more than any other, and more than any other character, with these world-altering crossover events that mean something for the landscape of the shared universe, God, it always hits Spider-Man the hardest.
Yeah,
Because
I
he's
know.
always got to start from complete square one when all of these things happen to him, because that's his struggle. And I will say, because I'm sure this will be brought up at some point in our conversation, but it would sound stupid if I didn't at least mention it at this point, the greatest reinvention and square one of the character, in my humble opinion, is the invention of Miles Morales. And so I just wanted to say his name at some point, because I got some things to say about Miles Morales. But in the context of reinventing and starting anew, I would be remiss to not say there's this big one that really matters.
Oh no, there's a specific character that I haven't even talked about yet, and I'm surprised I haven't, but I'm going to get to that character a little bit later. But yeah, so, you know, and we also have to say that this was when Todd McFarlane was drawing Spider-Man, and my God, he is still one of my personal idols in the world of comics and writing and all of that. Just he basically took Spider-Man and he pretty much broke all the rules. He's like, he had been called into the Marvel corporate offices so many times saying, I don't think a human being can move like that or bend like that. I think your eyes on him, on his costume, are too big. I think he's getting too dark, too violent. But oh my goodness, the minute that Venom showed up fully in Amazing Spider-Man 300, the game changed for the better. People adored the Venom character. And when Carnage came out in the 90s, they loved him even more because people were already loving what Venom was, but we all knew that underneath Venom, even though Eddie Brock may not have been the most purest of characters, he still was not a true monster. He was, unfortunately, and I think that's what's also very interesting, is here's Eddie Brock, a big, burly guy, looks like he's ex-Marines in the comics, and yet he seems to be being pushed around by this scrawny Peter Parker at the Daily Bugle. And here's where I'm going to throw out my character, J. Jonah Jameson. We have to talk about J. Jonah Jameson. I love how he pushes Spider-Man around, and I love how Peter, as Peter, not as Spider-Man, manages to talk about such foul things about him under his breath. Like, you got to give this kid credit, because anyone, because he's not even on salary at the Daily Bugle, he is getting freelance photography work. The fact that anyone out there, especially someone who is classified as Gen Z, you would have probably walked out after week number 1. The fact that Peter is resilient and he takes all this punishment besides the broken ribs. He takes the verbal abuse from J. Jonah Jameson, and it makes him so much more of an admirable role model to younger people because of the fact that, you know, if you keep doing what you're doing, you know your passion, just keep doing the daily grind, good things will eventually come your way. But Eddie Brock is pushed around, and when he gets this alien symbiote, thanks to Spider-Man, who got it during the Secret Wars, he goes up against Spider-Man. And also, when Todd McFarlane introduces Venom and has him going up against Spider-Man, the blood, the gore, it is incredible. And then when Carnage gets introduced, here's a spawn of Venom, and this is now officially embodying a serial killer. Here's a character that just loves to kill. I'm going to put a link in the box below about our discussion that Andy and I had about the Maximum Carnage storyline, because that is just a fun, exciting, and brutal comic book experience in a great way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I mean, there's a lot to tug on there, right? The motion and the action and the energy that Todd McFarlane brought to the character cannot be overstated, was incredibly important, especially at that time. You know, having Spider-Man retain his relevance and being the driving force behind that in the 80s in particular. You know, and Maximum Carnage, I mean, we talked about that in our video. So yeah, I encourage people to look at the link in the description, but really emblematic of that, not just violence, but brutality. I mean, we already talked a little bit about, can you remember a major Spider-Man story where he isn't swinging around complaining about his broken ribs? But I mean, that's like every page of Maximum Carnage.
And you can,
right?
and that's the thing, the art, and that's not even McFarlane art. That's what's so interesting.
Right, no.
When you see these fight scenes and you can see how much of a beating Spider-Man is taking through that art, you feel it. You feel that he's in pain.
You really do. And even though he's super strong and he is a superhero and he does have, you know, superhuman strength and heals a little bit faster than the average human does, and I mean, he's not Wolverine, but you get it. You know, you feel the brutality of what happens to Spider-Man in a way that you don't with Captain America or with Wolverine. Like he's more grounded. When he breaks a rib, and you think, I would hate that. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like it's really something. And I think you're also right to point out kind of more, I guess I'd call it like the anti-hero of Eddie Brock's Venom, right? Not completely all the way to a villain, but like a character that there are, you know, important disagreements with, commits crime, Spider-Man still has to stop him, still has to bring him in, but there's that kind of edge, that silver lining of sometimes their goals kind of align. Maximum Carnage, again, is a really great example, actually, of exploring that specific part of the Venom character, as well as Peter's relationship to that way of thinking, and coming around to doing the right thing in the end. But then Carnage being that all the way, to have that, like, okay, but now let's also have this polar opposite character. And that's really something special to have.
And Carnage was pretty much introduced when he was introduced, because that was also when Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson, who was actually drawing Amazing Spider-Man after Todd McFarlane left that book and got his own Spider-Man title, which lasted much longer than most people thought it would be after Todd McFarlane left after issue 16. But he took Eric Larson with him to form Image Comics, and we all know that story. But Carnage was introduced because of the fact that Marvel definitely felt that if Todd McFarlane was leaving, their fan base was going to be lost. So they had to get something good in there. And because of the fact that it was the 90s, you know, the extreme 90s, and you saw what was happening in the X-Men comics, which were the most popular. I mean, I think the best part about the 90s is the fact that the Spider-Man books said on the front of them, your favorite non-mutant Marvel superhero, because everybody was really just into the X-Men in the 1980s and 90s, and for good reason, that's for sure. But Carnage was there to really keep the fans on board, saying, even without these brilliant artists and writers, we can still give you the Spider-Man that you love, and yes, we can kick it up a notch if we try real hard. But the 90s, along with everything else in the world of comics, took a dive towards the end of that decade. And unfortunately, a lot of that, to a degree, was seen in some of the titles, stories that were coming out. Because talk about a real throwing of fans for a loop. All of a sudden, in the mid-90s, we find out that Peter Parker is a clone of a character named Ben Reilly, who is the original Spider-Man, and you get Maximum Clonage, and everybody hates it, yet everybody still buys it, except for me. I know that my pal Dan bought them, and I don't know what his overall thoughts are. And later on, there's a 4-part issue series called Spider-Man Revelations, which goes into 4 different Spider-Man titles where we find out, no, Ben Reilly was the clone and Peter Parker is your real Spider-Man. But then there was a really big surprise because I bought those comics when I was a kid and I never read them, so I finally read them a few years ago. I did not realize that Spider-Man 75, which was the last issue of the Revelation saga, was also the return of Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin. He like just showed up all of a sudden out of nowhere. But the funny thing is, as horrible as that story was, I mean, people still love Ben Reilly. I mean, nobody would be putting the Scarlet Spider on a t-shirt at this day and age if people didn't love Ben Reilly. He has a fan base. And that's another thing. Even the stuff that people don't like too much about Spider-Man still ends up leaving an impression. I mean, we also had the 2099 universe, and we were introduced to Miguel O'Hara. So that was another interesting thing that happened. And later on, we get all of these other Spider-Man. We get Miles Morales, we get Spider-Gwen, we get Spider-Noir, and yet people still don't care. It's Spider-Man. I love this world. I want to keep reading.
No, I think that's exactly right. And you named the important characters I was going to highlight, you know, because it's for every Ben Reilly, there's a Spider-Gwen, right? So there's something about, you know, the core of the character that resonates even when they're written differently, when they have slightly different origins. It's about that striving to do the best. It's about that superlative of being the most right intentioned, the most pure-hearted. It's why, I mean, look, cards on the table, my favorite Spider-Man is Miles Morales. I mean, Peter Parker will always have a very special place in my heart because the Spider-Man character means so much to me. And I love Peter. That's nothing disparaging about Peter. But it goes to show how exactly. It goes to show how, you know, infinitely relatable and infinitely creatable the character is. That, you know, reading Spider-Man stories my whole life, intimately familiar with the Spider-Man universe, somebody managed to create a new version of Spider-Man that somehow, gun to my head, is a favorite version of it years and years and years and years and decades into the character. That's insane. That doesn't happen with other media franchises.
Well, there's a reason why. Let's talk about Miles Morales, because he really is the new kid on the block still to this very day. And it is incredible to see how big his fan base is. I mean, again, the Academy Award winning movie, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, is not about Peter Parker. It stars a version of Peter Parker, but the main character is Miles Morales, who was introduced in a comic book called Ultimate Fallout, which was a miniseries, I believe, and it was issue number 4 where we were introduced to this brand new version of Spider-Man from another universe in the Marvel multiverse. The reason why I feel that this is a character that resonates right now and is beloved is based around a lot of what's going on right now in the social political landscape. I mean, I know that I am going to get so much flack for what I'm about to say, but let's take the example of the fact that there's going to be a live-action Little Mermaid film, and the live-action version of Ariel is going to not be a redheaded white girl, but it's going to be a black actress, Hailey Bailey. Absolutely fine. I don't care. Will I see it? No, because I don't care about these live-action Disney remakes. That's just me. That's the only reason why I don't want to see it. It has nothing to do with the color of the skin of the actress. But why am I saying this? Because we got Miles Morales, but he never replaced Peter Parker. We have Peter Parker, and we always will have Peter Parker, and now we just have another Spider-Man, and it's not for another audience. This is like Peter Parker. He is a character for everybody to enjoy. I wish that they would get great writers on Miles Morales as Spider-Man, because unfortunately they're rebooting his series again. And I've read some of the recent Miles Morales issues, and they just aren't good. And I'm not blaming that because it's Miles Morales. I'm not saying it's because of the fact that this version of Spider-Man, who is half African-American, half Hispanic, no, that's not why I'm disliking the comic books. I'm disliking the comic books because he is not getting the right writers to give us great Miles Morales Spider-Man stories. That is what everybody in the comic book world is saying right now. Give us good writers and good artists who are passionate about giving the fans a great story, and you will see the fans embrace it. And that's the thing. Miles Morales is a character that everybody is embracing regardless. But we need to see those people who are bringing this character to the forefront to have that exact same passion that we're just not seeing right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's a couple things. So one, I think we can look at it within the Spider-Man universe. Ben Reilly. I mean, we already talked about how Ben Reilly still has his fans and ended up being used in an interesting way.
He's back now, by the way.
Right. And I'm saying, like, the pushback to Ben Reilly kind of informs and fills you in on why Miles Morales worked so much, because Miles Morales is a different and unique take on the Spider-Man character that is completely his own. Whereas Ben Reilly was like a hackneyed, just trying to change and replace, and it was really gross and difficult, and it did not work with fans. Again, now it does, and there's ways that the Ben Reilly character has been used, but the genesis of it, all sorts of pushback, everybody hated it, blah 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 blah, all of that. But Miles, definitely not. And I also think that Miles is so great because in reinventing the character like that, it reaffirmed the outsider nerd aspect of the character that was so relatable, right? Because it's almost like we had Peter for so long that at a certain point we forget that he was the outsider, because Spider-Man, being on that 1A level with Batman, popular whether you like comics or not, you can sing along to Spider-Man. Spider-Man does whatever like, by recreating the character, you reassert some of that outsiderness. And by doing it recently, I mean, candidly, it makes the character of Miles more relatable to me than Peter, because I see him as a kid with similar experiences to me. Granted, I'm older than Miles, and I was when he was created too, but something about his high school experience with an element of social media existing at the time, with an element of trying to exist in New York City that looks like the New York City that I know. It matters, right? That Miles looks like and acts like my friends and me. Like, I think it was handled so beautifully, and there's a reason why. And I can't remember if you've read what was it? I guess, was it 2014 Secret Wars, 2016 Secret Wars?
I have not read anything that has the name Secret Wars on it.
Nothing. Okay, that's great.
You actually said to me that the more recent Secret Wars was okay, and it wasn't really anything special.
It's fine, but the thing that's in there's a few things in the recent Secret Wars that are really good. And obviously one of them that fans love, with, the beloved Ultimate Universe and elements of the Ultimate Universe still being pulled on now in the MCU more directly as well, and all this stuff coming together. Fans were delighted that the element of the Ultimate Universe that survived Secret Wars was Miles, and bringing him into
the 616,
current canonical 616 universe, which is wonderful. Yeah. But it shows how he can exist alongside Peter as his own character, who is also learning. And I could talk forever about Miles specifically. I mean, Brian Michael Bendis has one of my favorite takes on the Spider-Man character, both the Ultimate Universe Peter and the genesis of Miles Morales. I love Into the Spider-Verse. It's a contender for my favorite comic movie, right up there with, The Dark Knight, right up there with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. It's funny that multiple of my favorite potential comic movies are centered around
We'll
Spider-Man.
get
Now
into
that I'm
those
realizing
soon.
that, but just it's beautiful and it's wonderful, and not enough can be said about the importance of Miles being his own character who has the Spider-Man mantle, and just important for us to say a little bit here in this episode about Spider-Man, about how much Miles matters and how much people love him, how much I love him. So I'm glad just to take that moment to plant that flag and say that is important in an episode that claims to be about Spider-Man.
And that's another thing. I mean, the fact that Miles Morales is a character that is beloved so much also shows you the power of just how amazing Spider-Man is. Excuse the pun there, if you all saw what I just did. The fact that this specific character spawned so many other characters that could actually carry their own titles also says a great deal about how iconic Spider-Man is. I mean, there have been numerous Venom series, including the most recent one that was written by Donny Cates, which is a big fan favorite amongst many. And it was Donny Cates who also took Carnage to the next level with the Absolute Carnage saga, which would also give us the symbiote god in Null, aka the King in Black, which was a big thing literally in just the last 2 or 3 years. And the fact that you could have all of these characters carry their own titles, because Spider-Gwen has her own title from time to time. As we said, Miles Morales has his own title. I mean, even Spider-Ham has his own series. So the fact that one character could spawn, and another little funny little joke I just did over there, everybody, the fact that we could get all of these spin-off comics. Some of the other big names had tried those, and they were never as successful. I mean, the Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen comics didn't last that long. In regards to Batman, there have been some successful ones. I think the only other comic book character outside of Batman and Spider-Man that have had so many spin-offs that actually develop their own loyal fan bases to a degree, I think the most successful is X-Men.
Yeah, probably. I think that's right. And also, I'm glad you mentioned Spider-Gwen again, because while I'm not as intimately familiar with like the core Spider-Gwen series, there are definitely Spider-Man fans out there who will crucify us for not having enough to say about that. So that's a lack of my own knowledge, but I'm aware of how beloved the Spider-Gwen character is. Most of my knowledge of Spider-Gwen comes from crossover in the comics with the Miles line, as well as, you know, an important inclusion into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, and another thing that I really appreciate is the fact that the writers will take some of their own stories and still give us some elements from previous stories that were done in the past. I mean, Absolute Carnage was a big fan favorite amongst many, and some of the tie-ins, especially in the individual Spider-Man issues, one of the interesting things that happened was there was a big piece of that story that involved Spider-Man and Norman Osborn, all because of the fact that when Dan Slott was writing The Amazing Spider-Man, right before we got to issue number 800, it is also crazy to say that we now have over 900 issues of The Amazing Spider-Man after 2022. And the fact that he took this little story called Going Down Swinging, which a lot of people who are haters of Dan Slott will always say that that is the greatest Spider-Man story he ever wrote, because it was introduced to Norman Osborn getting the Carnage symbiote and using his Green Goblin serum to mix together and create the vicious and brutal Red Goblin. When Absolute Carnage happened, Norman Osborn almost lost his mind, and Spider-Man was there to bring him back. And that's what I love. And that's what I love about all of these specific characters, because of all of these big names or up-and-coming names that use this lore in great ways most of the time to bring these characters back.
And what you're saying is exactly right, because I think an important part of how the character is written is that because we have this shared history with Spider-Man, and because we have these big, bold, emblematic like moments, it gives writers the freedom to trust the readers to be able to follow the importance of the story they're writing, because these big moments go outside of comics and are so widely known that they're into, you know, everybody knows the death of Uncle Ben and the impact that it has on Spider-Man. Maybe you need to be a little bit more into comics to get some of the other moments, but you know, I think about like No Way Home, letting Andrew Garfield have his moment to save the girl, which goes back to everything that we were saying about you rereading The Death of Gwen Stacy, the transformative moment for comics outside of it. It's these big things that matter and come back, and the readers are there for it, and it lets writers have a freedom to do what they want and know that people will be along for the ride and understand it.
And that's where I want to go after this. It's also because Spider-Man is someone that is beloved amongst many, and many of these people who love Spider-Man have never even picked up a Spider-Man comic in their lives. They know Spider-Man because of the 1967 cartoon series. They know him because of the 1983 cartoon series, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. They know him because of the 1995 animated series. They know him because
of a questionable ice cream pop.
Exactly. They know him because of director Sam Raimi, because of the fact that in 2002, we got the Spider-Man on the big screen that we had all been waiting for, because at the time we were learning these new CGI technologies, and the fact that they said that Spider-Man, when he was going to be swinging off of buildings, was going to be all digital, people were scared because we were only getting to this true peak of visual effects technology glory thanks to the start of it with the Phantom Menace back in 1999. And when Spider-Man the movie came out, Spider-Man, even though he was already big, he exploded. Like, everybody now adored Spider-Man, even if they only knew him through the face of Tobey Maguire. People who never saw Willem Dafoe in a movie knew who Willem Dafoe was when he played Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin, and that is still, to my personal opinion, Willem Dafoe's greatest performance.
And I think you're right to point out some of those other forms of media that he's been in. You know, I'm glad I mentioned No Way Home. We've both mentioned Into the Spider-Verse, talking about the Sam Raimi films, which are so important. Spider-Man 2 is one of my absolute favorite comic book movies of all time. The Sam Raimi take on heroes and the cuts to the crowd, it lands for me so much, and it's so comic booky. Let's also talk a little bit just about, you know, Spider-Man is really important in video games.
Absolutely.
There's a ton of people that know him from the Maximum Carnage Super Nintendo game, which is one of, you know, the best, or Genesis as well, but one of the best, like, classic side-scroller beat-em-ups of all time.
Also the Spider-Man arcade game.
Exactly, the Spider-Man arcade game. I mean, in more recent memory, there's a phenomenal PlayStation 4 Spider-Man game, as well as a follow-up starring Miles, which I have not played yet because I was waiting until I got a PS5, which I just did about 2 weeks ago. So now I'm going to play it, and I'll let you know if it's as good. But everything I hear is great. And it's just that Spider-Man is used all throughout pop culture because he works. And,
yeah.
And people love it. And all this media is good. It's not just comics. People have things to point to that they love all throughout pop culture.
Yeah, another thing that I completely forgot to mention, most people completely forgot that short-lived MTV animated series, The Ultimate Spider-Man, and I believe Neil Patrick Harris voiced him.
Yeah, that's a weird one. But that's the thing. He's so in pop culture that there's always going to be stuff like that, because I know what's going to happen. We'll end the episode, and at some point next week, we'll text about how did he not mention X? And that's just because he's a ubiquitous character, completely everywhere, and it's all important. That's why I keep going back to the 1A with Batman. Spider-Man is one of, or the most important comic book characters of all time.
Everybody also loves, I can't even remember the name of this animated series because I've never watched it, but the one where Drake Bell voices him, like, everybody loves that Spider-Man cartoon, and I cannot for the life of me remember the name of it. So people, Please don't hate me. Just put your comments in the box below and tell me which cartoon had the voice of Drake Bell as Spider-Man. But
we know it exists, and it's more recent than the stuff we're talking about, but we know it's important too.
Yes, and the other thing is, even when things are so high, they unfortunately still fall flat, because then we got Spider-Man 3. But I'm not going to blame Sam Raimi for that. I blame corporate for that, because they did the exact same thing that killed the first Batman franchise before Christopher Nolan took it over. They tried to introduce too many characters at once, including too many stories. They did the same thing at Fox with the X-Men films, with X-Men 3: The Last Stand. I mean, what hurt me the most was, how could you destroy the Spider-Man franchise with the most beloved Spider-Man story? You did the same thing with the X-Men when you introduced the Dark Phoenix. I'm like, how do you do this? And the craziest thing is, both Sony and Fox did it twice.
Let's not forget, though, we're talking about a low of Spider-Man, right? And yet
we're still talking about how much we love it.
Spider-Man 3 that are beloved. People know that I'm an avid video game player. In Destiny 2, my character's emote is the Bully Maguire dance. Like, I mean, it matters. There's a reason that wonderful opening of Into the Spider-Verse, which goes into a little bit of the history of Spider-Man, specifically has him dancing down the street. It's one of the most memeable things ever produced, and it's from a low moment of Spider-Man.
Yeah.
So there's always something to enjoy.
And I will also say that I did also go to theaters, and I did see the 2 Mark Webb Amazing Spider-Man films. I didn't like the first one that much with Andrew Garfield, but I loved the second film, and I was so, because the other thing is, I also, even though he doesn't show up in many movies right now, I love Dane DeHaan as Harry Osborn. I thought he was better than James Franco. I want to say that right now, because as great as James Franco was in the first 2 Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, he was terrible on the third one. And I will also say this is just me speaking as a fan. I think that Spider-Man 3 killed Topher Grace's career in film.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. I definitely can see that. But I'll also say, let's take this as an opportunity to say how important and expansive the Spider-Man universe is, that we could do an entire episode on the Green Goblin. We could do an entire episode on the Sinister Six, or any member of the Sinister Six. We could do an entire episode on Mary Jane Watson. We could do an entire episode on Aunt May. And these are all characters that resonate with people and that are an integral part of all of these stories. As we go on and we talk about actors and the different roles and the minutia of the different stories, it's important to remember that there's absolutely no way that we could cover everything that's important about Spider-Man in one episode. It's just a chance to gush about it.
As far as I'm concerned, the most important thing that the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films gave me was J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. He is the only way that I will look at J. Jonah Jameson from now on, because he is absolutely perfect. And thanks to that movie, he went on to do other movies that people rushed to see, and even got an Academy Award for Whiplash. By the way, Andy, I don't know if you've seen Whiplash.
No, it is high on my list. Everybody tells me I would love it.
You and your wife are getting your asses over to my house as soon as you can, and we're going to watch it because I own it. And this is finally going to make my wife sit down and watch it with us, because I want everybody to see that movie, because you will be forever changed by J.K. Simmons' performance in there. And I mean,
all the musicians in my life tell me I'd love it.
It's a brilliant film. And the other thing is, the thing that really upset me about the Mark Webb films just dying so quickly was just because I saw so much potential in those films. And we didn't get the worst of actors either. I mean, Jamie Foxx as Electro and Reese Ifans as the Lizard. And also, I am a big Sally Field fan. She is my favorite actress of all time, and her as Aunt May was such great casting. But then Spider-Man finally joined the MCU, and we got a And I think the thing about the Spider-Man films in the MCU was they took a look at all the things that made the previous Spider-Man films great and what caused them to fail. And the biggest thing that they did for the new Spider-Man films was they actually cast a kid to play Peter, because this is a fun fact for a lot of people. Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were turning 30 when they were cast as Spider-Man. They were playing a high school / college kid in their 30s. Tom Holland was 19 when we first saw him in Captain America: Civil War. And what I loved about Tom Holland was he really brought the adolescent element of Spider-Man that was missing from the other films. But even more importantly, the one thing that I always harp on when it comes to the previous Spider-Man films was there wasn't enough Spider-Man being Spider-Man. We really focused on the love stories. There is love stories in the recent 3 Spider-Man films, but they really take a look at the superhero elements of Peter. And that's one of the main reasons why I believe the John Watts trilogy is the best, and also because of the fact that we finally got to Spider-Man: No Way Home. And what did it do? It basically said, much like a lot of the characters in the comics, these previous films, even the Venom films, matter.
They sure do. And on that note, the Venom movie, phenomenal.
I still haven't seen it.
Everybody watch it.
I have to see it.
It's the campiest. Oh, God. If you sat down and tried to make that movie knowing what it ended up, you couldn't do it. It needs to be made completely wholeheartedly and with no irony. The Venom movie is phenomenal.
Yeah. Did you see the sequel, by the way?
I still haven't seen the sequel.
Yeah,
I'm a little nervous about the sequel because what made the first one so good, it's the camp. You can't sit down and make it. I'm worried that Venom 2 is tainted by hindsight of realizing what they did with Venom 1.
Well,
so it's a beautiful thing.
I don't know, man. When I found out they cast Woody Harrelson as Carnage, I mean, I don't own this movie, but I have seen Natural Born Killers, and I said to myself, if you want to talk about an actor who can play a serial killer well, it is Woody Harrelson to a T. So that was such a great idea. But no, we're just gonna mention this movie, and we're not gonna talk about it because I have no interest in seeing it. No, we're not gonna talk about Morbius.
Yeah, don't gotta go into it. It's fine.
Jared Leto. I mean, I love Jared Leto as an actor, but he can't seem to get the right comic book projects. I mean, I will always have a soft spot for him as the Joker. I like him as the Joker. I really do.
Yeah, that's fair. No, I mean, I still kind of like Jared Leto, but you're right. Something about his role in comic films just never quite there.
Yeah, but no, I mean, Spider-Man: No Way Home, you know, along with the rest of the John Watts trilogy, I really appreciated the fact that they really didn't go all the way back to the beginning with Peter, and they only mentioned it from time to time. And even though there was a great deal of change in regards to what they did with him in that trilogy, because at the very beginning, he gets his first major Spider-Man suit from Tony Stark. Now, that is, of course, a little callback to Spider-Man in Civil War when he gets the Iron Spider outfit. But what made me very happy was, outside of all the other greatness that happened in No Way Home, it was the last scene of the film when you see him in the apartment and you see the sewing machine, and then you see him web slinging in the middle of New York City in the middle of winter, right before Christmas, because you see the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree, and you're wondering where Hawkeye is in that scene, because you know he's there somewhere. And that was really what made me so happy. I was like, oh, thank goodness. So Tom Holland is going to be coming back as Spider-Man for a whole new series of films. So it's only making me more curious, because the one thing about the current Spider-Man world is the fact that we don't have an Oscorp, and we kind of really have to have an Oscorp. So I'm really curious to see where we're going with that. But look, even with all of the shortcomings, whether it's in comics or whether it's in film, we all still get excited whenever we hear that there is something new coming with the Spider-Man name attached to it. That's the long and the short of it.
It really is. And I mean that I continue to be excited to see where the movies go, where the comics go, to see what new writers are going to bring to the Spider-Man character, to see what new Spider-Men and women are going to exist in the future, and to see how they're written and what new they bring to the table. The Spider-Man character, because of being in a state of reinvention and finding themselves and being pure-hearted, will always be relatable, will always be exciting, and will always be one of the most beloved comic book characters of all time.
So we're going to conclude this because, my goodness, did we cover a ton of ground. I just want to know, before we close it out, what is your favorite Spider-Man story and what is your favorite incarnation of Spider-Man?
I figured you would ask that, so I thought a lot about it, and I have actually landed on both Into the Spider-Verse and Miles Morales.
Okay.
I know I gushed about Miles already. I'll mention I love Into the Spider-Verse for the exact reasons that I said I love the Miles character. I think it brings everything I love about Spider-Man into the current day in a way that resembles my life and the lives of my friends, and makes the Peter character even more relatable, to be an outsider and a nerd in the way that I understand being an outsider and a nerd. And there's any number of examples I can give. The thing that bubbles to the top of my mind is just being introduced to Miles in that film, with him half singing along and not knowing all the words to Sunflower. There's something about that was just perfect. And I don't think there's a wrong answer here. So even though you're about to say two different things than me, I'm not going to sit here and tell you you're wrong. And I think that's the beauty of the Spider-Man character. But yeah, that's what I got.
So in regards to Spider-Man, I mean, you probably would think that my favorite would be the last issue of Spider-Man that Todd McFarlane ever drew, which tied into X-Force, where Spider-Man faced the Juggernaut, but it's not. Believe it or not, my favorite Spider-Man story is the very first Spider-Man comic that I ever purchased when I was a kid, because I didn't realize how significant it was, and I didn't realize how important it was going to be. But that's Spectacular Spider-Man 200, because it's the death of Harry Osborn. And just what Spider-Man goes through, seeing the death of his best friend, even though he unfortunately had to fight him. But the most important thing about that story was, in the end, it wasn't Spider-Man who killed Harry. It was the fact that Harry died trying to do something good. And that's really what really hits home there in regards to that. And in regards to everything else in Spider-Man, I honestly have to say that Tom Holland's Spider-Man trilogy, directed by John Watts, he just grew on me. And I think it's just because of the fact that these three films that Tom Holland was in, and the other times that, I mean, his scene in Avengers Infinity War when he dies, it's just, how many, I didn't cry, but I heard grown men crying in that theater when I went to see that movie. It was just like, that this happens in comic books. You knew that they were going to let the people who were going to survive the snap was going to be the original Avengers lineup. So you knew that Spider-Man was going to die. And yet when you see it happen, and the fact that he hugs Tony and he's crying saying, "I don't want to go," I was like, Toby and Andrew couldn't give me that. And Tobey Maguire shed a ton of tears in his trilogy, but none of that could compare to what happened in that one moment. And when, in No Way Home, when Aunt May dies, and she says to him while she's dying, "With great power comes great responsibility." Whoa. Just whoa.
Beautifully done. I agree completely. It's exactly what I said. What you were going to say was going to be different than mine. but it wasn't going to be wrong.
But I will say, though, I will still say that all of you fans out there, I am just going to say this right now. Miles Morales is coming to the MCU. I mean, they couldn't have been foreshadowing it more. It goes all the way back to Spider-Man Homecoming when you see Donald Glover talking about how he has a nephew. You hear Electro in Spider-Man No Way Home saying, "You're just a kid from Queens. I thought you might be a black Spider-Man," to which Tom Holland says, "I have a feeling there's a black Spider-Man somewhere out there." So nothing would make me happier than to see Tom Holland continue to reprise his role as Peter, but get to the point where it's time for him to go and to pass the torch on to a young black actor who's going to play Miles Morales and say, "It is your time. Show the audience of the MCU what you can do, sir."
Hell yeah.
That's what I want personally.
I agree wholeheartedly. Hell yeah.
Yep. And there's one more thing that I want to say. Thanks to the world of Spider-Man, particularly Into the Spider-Verse, Nicolas Cage finally got his Spider-Man role, which is what he's wanted for years.
Which it's all that really matters at the end of the day.
I couldn't finish this discussion without mentioning Nicolas Cage. We have to. But anyway, everybody, that's going to wrap up another character profiles. Thank you all so much for watching. This is always fun. Andy and I are going to be back very soon. We have a very special video coming soon, and Cammy's going to be with us. And we have a whole bunch of other must-be-reads and other character profiles coming. We actually hoping that it's going to happen before the end of 2022. I think it's going to, Andy, but we have a very interesting character profiles coming up next. I think you are all going to be very surprised with the character that we have chosen, because it's probably a character you don't know or you haven't heard about in a very long time. But in the meantime, everybody, we will see you in the next one.
Thanks so much.